Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Physiology Made Easy with me, Dr. Amir Sandhu. Now in today's video we're going to talk about the anatomy of the heart, one of the most important organs in our body. Now the information is going to be extremely useful to those individuals that are doing work that's equivalent to A levels or AS levels in the UK, whether that be physical education, medicine or biology. So let's get straight into it. Now the heart is our body's pump, so it's pumping blood that it's receiving from the blood vessels around the body. It's sending that to the lungs to be oxygenated, and then it's pumping that back out to all of the tissues in the body again. Now, in an average person, a healthy person, the heart rate is around about 75 beats per minute. So that would mean that your heart is beating around about 108,000 times in a given day. That's approximately 39 million times a year, and over a 75-year lifespan, your heart is pumping away or beating away around about 3 billion times. So it's a muscle which is working extremely hard. Now, every time the heart beats, it's pumping about 70 milliliters of blood out to the tissues of the body, and that's equivalent to around about 5.25 litres per minute. So each beat is 70 mil, and over a minute we're having about 5 litres of blood being pumped out, and over the course of the day that's 14,000 litres. Now if you exercise, we have the heart starts to pump around about 20 litres of blood when we're doing heavy aerobic exercise. So the capacity for the heart to pump even more blood is there, but at rest it's about 5 litres, and all of that blood is pumped to the body via our circulatory system, so our blood vessels, our capillaries, which consists of the arteries, the capillaries and the veins as well. And they all come to a total distance of around 60,000 miles. So we have about 60,000 miles worth of blood vessels in our body. Okay, so whereabouts is the heart actually located? Well, the heart is located in an area between the lungs called the mediastinum. Okay, so we can see a dotted line. If we zoom in a little bit here, we can see a dotted line or dashed line across here, and this is where the heart actually resides. Okay, so it's in between the two lungs, and crucially, what's important is that the heart has the base, which is often referred to as the base of the heart, where the blood vessels stem from, the great blood vessels. So the base of the heart is located here, and the apex of the heart is around this corner here where the left ventricle lies. So we will talk a little bit about the anatomy in further detail with the 4 chambers, but this would be where the right atrium is, the right ventricle, the left atrium and the left ventricle. Now the heart is about the size of a clenched fist. It weighs anywhere from 250 to 350 grams. It's generally heavier in males, so 300 to 350 grams in males. And what we can see here as well is the pericardial cavity. I will zoom back out so you can see all of the labels, but what I want to do is just show you the kind of structure, a lubricating structure called the pericardial cavity. This is the blue line that we can see here. This is filled with fluid, and it basically provides lubrication as the heart is contracting and pumping blood to the rest of the body. So it's located within the mediastinum. It's got a pericardial cavity. The base of the heart is where the great blood vessels stem from, and the apex of the heart is located at the bottom. We've got the diaphragm muscle here, which obviously helps with the respiratory effort, moving air into and out of the lungs, and so it's very important when we think about the blood vessels as well, because this is the great blood vessel, one of the great blood vessels, the aorta. So that takes blood from the left ventricle and sends it out to the rest of the body, to all of the tissues of the body as well. So this is the aortic arch, or the arch of the aorta. We can also see here one of the great veins. So this is the superior vena cava. So this is drawing deoxygenated blood that's given up its oxygen, it's used blood, it's drawing that blood back in to the right atrium, and then it's going to go through actually to the ventricle and then into the pulmonary trunk. So it's going to go to the pulmonary artery, off to the lungs. We can't quite see it on this image here, but the pulmonary artery will take the deoxygenated blood. It's the only time an artery carries deoxygenated blood to the lungs for it to be oxygenated. So this is pretty much the location of the heart, and the key thing for you to just be familiar about is that we have these various different structures: the base, the apex, the great blood vessels, the mediastinum, and the pericardial cavity. What's interesting as well, there is a little appendage, an ear-like appendage on both sides. So there's the right auricle and left auricle, and this is often not referred to in textbooks. So these are like these ear-like projections which actually don't have much of a function. What we do know is that they act as decompression chambers. So when the pressure in the atria increases, they can take up some of that pressure, but there is a greater risk of blood, particularly in the left side, clotting in the auricle, leading to a stroke. So quite often, in some individuals that are susceptible to clots and have a greater stroke risk, the left auricle is actually closed and it doesn't have any meaningful effect on function. Okay, so when we think about the chambers and then the circulation through the heart, we've got 4 chambers, and we can split our heart into the left side and into the right side. Now, to keep it very basic, the right side of the heart pumps blood to the lungs for the blood to be oxygenated and for the CO2 to be given up to the alveoli, which we then breathe out. So that's what the right side does. The left side of our heart is involved in pumping blood to all of the tissues in our body. So all of the organs, the muscle tissue, the skin, so any tissue in the body will be supplied by the heart from the left side, okay? We can then do some further divisions as well. We can actually look at the atria and the ventricles and see what's actually going on. So this whole purpose of the heart being a double pump, so every time the heart beats, it acts as a double pump. It's pumping blood to the lungs and it's pumping blood to the tissues. Okay, the right side to the lungs, the left side to the tissues of the body. So it's a double pump. All of the blood from the right side goes into the pulmonary circuit. All of the blood on the left side goes into the systemic circuit, so the systemic circulation. So we've got the great vessels, which we talked about. Now what I want to do now is just zoom in a little bit to this diagram here and just show you the double pump. So what we can actually see here then is the heart located in the mediastinum, and we can see this is the superior vena cava. So this is one of the great veins bringing blood, deoxygenated blood from all of the tissues in the upper part of the body. Now this is the inferior vena cava, okay, so this is the inferior vena cava, and that's also feeding blood into the right atrium, and it's bringing deoxygenated blood from all of our lower extremities, from our digestive tract and abdominal organs as well. So all of that deoxygenated blood is filtering into the right atrium. Okay, so that's what's happening. The veins are bringing blood back into the right atrium. Then what's happening is that blood is actually being forced into the ventricle. It flows into the ventricle, and essentially what happens is when the ventricle contracts, when the right ventricle contracts, it sends blood up through the pulmonary artery, and then that goes to your left and to your right lung. Okay, so we always orientate these images as if we're looking at them. So on this side, this is the right side, as my right side would be here, and this is the left side, as my left side would be here. So it goes to the left and the right lung, and we've got lots, millions, if not billions, of capillaries in the lungs that kind of wrap around the alveoli. Okay, so the airways. And what happens is a process of diffusion. So the carbon dioxide diffuses into the alveoli and we breathe out, and the breath that we've taken in, so taken in some oxygen, that oxygen has got in to the alveoli, diffused into the capillaries, and we can now see with these arrows that that oxygenated blood is coming back in to the left side of the heart. So it's coming back into the left atrium from both sides of the lungs. From the left atrium, the blood will flow through into the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle will contract. And what we can see here is that contraction of the left ventricle causes blood to go into the aorta. So remember the aortic arch that we were talking, which has offshoots, multiple offshoots, and that will take blood to the different tissues of the body. So you have the aortic arch, and you have the aorta in general, which is then taking blood to all of the tissues in our body. And that's essentially how the double pump works. So one side is pumping blood to the lungs to pick up oxygenated blood, and the other side is pumping to the rest of the body to supply the tissues with oxygenated blood, okay? And we can just again see the pathway in this image here. Now, what's also important for me to highlight now is that to prevent backflow of blood, we actually have valves. On the right side, we have the tricuspid valve. So this is the tricuspid valve. And on the left side, we have the bicuspid valve, okay? Sometimes also known clinically as the mitral valve. Now, these two valves are known as atrio-ventricular valves. Okay? Atrio-ventricular valves, and they're abbreviated as AV valves. That's because they reside between the atria and the ventricle. Okay, so we have them on both sides, the right side, tricuspid valve, the left side, the bicuspid mitral valve. And the idea is that these valves allow blood to flow into the ventricle without any problem, but when the ventricle fills up with blood and it starts getting ready to contract, then the valves will start to be closed shut. Okay, and as they close shut, it prevents any of the blood in the ventricle from going backwards. You don't want blood going backwards. The job of a pump is to pump things forward into the lungs, forward into the systemic tissues of the body. So just having a look here if there's anything else. We've talked about the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava. We've talked about the great blood vessels as well. We will go into a little bit more depth with the valves in just a short moment, but that's basically the basic premise of the circulation. We've got the heart working as a double pump. Okay, so the layers of the heart then. So we've actually, the heart mainly consists of the myocardium, which is a very thick muscular layer. It basically consists of cardiomyocytes, which are muscle cells, which are involved in causing the contraction, which forces the blood to either the lungs or to the rest of the body. Now, the myocardium actually, before we get to the myocardium, we actually have the outer layers of the heart as well, which we can see here. So in the first slide or the second slide, I talked about the pericardial cavity. So I talked about this cavity filled with lubricating fluid. So every time the heart beats, it's lubricated from its surrounding structures. The pericardial cavity actually is protected by the fibrous pericardium, which is a very tough connective tissue. It's very dense, it's very tough, and it's a connective tissue. Now, you have the fibrous pericardium, then you have a layer of what we call serous pericardium, the parietal serous pericardium, and then you have the pericardial cavity. And then we have an epicardium, which is another inner layer of the pericardium, sorry. The myocardium, and then you have the inside layer of the heart, the very deep layers of your heart. Perhaps the layer that's in contact with the blood is the endocardium. Okay, so the endocardium is also very much part of the heart. It's shown quite thinly here, but it's an extremely important part of the heart. And there's many blood vessels, microvessels, and nerve fibers that go right the way through to the endocardium in order for the heart to contract in a rhythmical manner. Now, there is a condition called cardiac tamponade, which happens when we have excess fluid accumulating in the pericardial cavity. And essentially what that does is every time the heart beats, the fluid kind of accumulates to the point then that it can cause inflammation of the pericardium as well, and can eventually lead to death. Now, the increase in fluid can occur from medical conditions such as hypothyroidism, where it occurs over a slower period of time, or it can occur from other problems such as cancer or injury or trauma to the heart as well. But the main thing is when you have excess fluid in the pericardial cavity, it does need to be drained out because otherwise it can lead to fatality. So that's the layers of the heart. So it's important just to know what the heart wall actually consists of. Okay, so moving on then to the right side, so we'll talk about the four chambers now. We'll we'll think specifically what the specific structures are within the heart itself. So we'll focus first on the right atrium and the right ventricle. Now, what you can see in this image here is kind of partially the right atrium. You can't fully see the right atrium, but we can see some of the main structures. So we can see that there are what we call orifices for the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. These are essentially the holes where the deoxygenated blood can get into the right atrium. Okay, so we can see that. We can see the right auricle again, that ear-shaped part, which doesn't really have a specific function, just on top of the ventricle as well. And what I want to really bring your attention to at the moment is the right ventricle. because in the right ventricle we can see a complex series of things going on. We can see these strands, which are the chordae tendineae. We can also see papillary muscles as well, which are on the surface, on the inner surface of the heart, okay, and we can see trabeculations as well. And we'll talk a little bit about why the ventricle actually has those in just a short moment of time. We also have another orifice here, which is the coronary sinus orifice. So a lot of the blood on the coronary vessels, which you can see on the surface of the heart here, the deoxygenated blood from these vessels actually draws into the right atrium directly. So the heart obviously has its own blood supply, and when the myocardium is working hard, it's using up the oxygen, it's producing blood which has which has a lower amount of oxygen in, and so that blood also needs to get into the circulation to be reoxygenated. Getting my terms mixed up. So that's basically the right atrium and the right ventricle. So what we now need to think about is these structures here. So it's very important that when we have blood moving from the right atrium and into the right ventricle, or the left atrium into the left ventricle, that when the blood is in the ventricles, we don't actually have that blood flowing back into the atrium again. We want it to go forward either into the pulmonary artery or into the aorta, okay? And in order to be able to ensure that the blood doesn't flow back, we have the tricuspid and bicuspid valve, and essentially what happens is as these chambers fill up, so let's just bring this onto the screen here. So as the right and the left ventricle starts filling up, and the ventricle gets ready actually to contract, the pressure inside here is higher than the pressure in the atria, okay? And what that does is it causes these valves, which are normally open during the relaxation phase of the heart, to close. So the valves close. Now the pressure inside these chambers can get very high in order for the blood to be moved forward into the pulmonary or systemic circulation. And in order to prevent these valves from bulging backwards towards the atria, the flaps of the valves are connected to papillary muscles, which are located on the surface of the ventricle wall. They're connected via chordae tendineae. These are like strings. So sometimes you've probably heard somebody's pulling on my heartstrings. That term originates from here. So your chordae tendineae are strings which attach to the flap, and those strings are attached to the papillary muscles. So when the right ventricle and the left ventricle, this is the muscular part, the myocardium, when that contracts, then essentially at the same time the papillary muscles are also contracting. When they contract, they pull on these heartstrings, on these chordae tendineae, and they prevent that valve, instead of it going backwards and upwards with the pressure, they keep it in that kind of closed position, and that prevents the backflow of blood. Okay, so these are extremely important physiologically or biologically, so that's the function of the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid mitral valve that we've got just here. So it's the same structure on both the left and the right side. Now, what's important actually is that these are this is the pulmonic valve for the pulmonary artery, and this is the aortic valve. They don't have the chordae tendineae and papillary muscles, and the reason for that, we'll talk about it in a couple of slides time when we get to it, but just to put a seed into your mind, the reason for that is because the pressure difference between the atria and the ventricle is much greater than the pressure difference between the ventricle and the arteries, and so the blood moving out of the ventricle into the arteries is enough to open them, and then when the pressure in the arteries is greater, so when they've got lots of blood flowing through them, that pressure is enough to close these valves automatically. But with the atrio-ventricular valves, they do need the support from the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles. One structure that I haven't mentioned so far that's quite important is the septum. Okay, so this is this is a muscular part of the heart which separates the right and left sides. Okay, so the heart does have the septum as well, and that's quite important. So again, here we've actually got an image, a real image of the right side of the heart, and we can see the chordae tendineae, we can see the papillary muscles on the walls of the ventricles, and we can see these projections, these kind of rounded or irregular projections of muscle on the surface of the heart as well. Those are known as trabeculae carneae. Hopefully I've pronounced that correctly, but the trabeculae carneae, and they are also involved actually in pulling on the papillary muscle, on the chordae tendineae, and they're also involved in the muscle contraction as well. And when the muscle actually contracts to force blood, this structure is also involved in that as well. So let's go back to here. So the papillary muscles contract when the ventricular contraction occurs. That's the key thing to note. And essentially that pulls on the chordae tendineae, that pulls the valve towards the ventricle and prevents it from bulging backwards, okay, into the atria. And this all happens when the ventricles are contracting. So when the ventricles contract, you want that blood to be moving forwards. You don't want the pressure inside here acting against these valves and causing them to kind of move backwards and bulge the other way, because then you'll get leakage of blood back into the atria and you won't get such efficient blood flow moving forward. Okay, so the left atrium very much has very similar features as well. The key difference with the left side of the heart, particularly in the ventricle, is the greater muscle mass, the myocardium, the cardiomyocytes. There's greater amounts of cardiomyocytes. The myocardium is bigger on the left side, and that's because it needs to overcome greater pressures in the aorta, in the systemic circulation, to open the aortic valve and get blood flowing to the rest of the body. Okay, so the left side of the heart is much more muscular, and with endurance training, for example, those individuals that do regular endurance training, they have what we call left ventricular hypertrophy, so they get very thick left ventricles, and it means that every time their heart beats, it pumps with quite a lot of force, and you have much more blood flow going to the rest of the body, and so you've got more efficient delivery of blood to the rest of the body as well. So again, we can see the left atrial appendage. As I was saying before, there is a risk that can become occluded with clots or blocked with clots and increase the risk of stroke. It doesn't seem to have a function, it doesn't seem to have a particular function on the heart itself. Okay, so we've kind of talked at length about the heart valves, but I wanted to have just a couple of last slides about the importance, just so you can see visually what's actually happening. So it's very important that you are able to memorize that the right atrio-ventricular valves are known as the tricuspid valves, and the left atrio-ventricular valves are known as the bicuspid valve or bicuspid mitral valve. And then we've also got a valve which is the pulmonary valve, which is between the right ventricle and, well, it's not between the right ventricle, but it's in the pulmonary artery, but it stops backflow of blood from the pulmonary artery into the right ventricle, which is located just here. And then we've also got the aortic valve as well, and that's stopping backflow of blood from the aorta into the left ventricle. These are known as semi-lunar valves. Okay, so these are known as semi-lunar valves. They've got these cusps here, so we can see with the tricuspid and bicuspid valves as well, they've got these cusps. We can see 3 cusps or leaflets as well, as they're sometimes known, and these are obviously attached to the papillary muscles via chordae tendineae. Okay. Now, importantly, I was going to say before that I'll explain why the aortic valve and the pulmonic valve do not have the chordae tendineae, and the reason for that is that the pressure, once the ventricles have contracted, the pressure in the arteries after that point is quite high, and that causes these valves just to snap shut. So when the ventricle is actually contracted and blood has been forced in towards the lungs or towards the rest of the body in the pulmonary artery or aorta, these valves actually just snap shut because the pressure of the pressure in the arteries is so high, it's higher than in the ventricles. So that's what happens here. What's important as well is that these semi-lunar valves are quite narrow. They're much narrower than the atrio-ventricular valves, and so there's also a greater risk of damage to these valves as well. So the aortic and pulmonary valves often have high amounts of blood flow, and we get what we call mechanical abrasion occurring, which damages the edges of these leaflets here. So that can then lead to problems with the valves, which can lead to further cardiac problems as well. Now, it's not surprising then that these valves are made, they're slightly more reinforced. So they're made of endothelium or endocardium tissue. They've also got a lot of connective tissue as well, which makes them very thick and dense and strong. The tricuspid and bicuspid valves also have endocardium or endothelial tissue as well, and they also have connective tissue as well. You do want the valves to be relatively strong because they've got to stop the blood from moving backwards. Okay, so now it's very important just to get your mind around when these valves are actually open. Okay, so we will talk through in future videos about the cardiac cycle and how what's actually happening in the atria and ventricles and what's happening in the valves at different stages of the cardiac cycle as blood moves through those chambers. But I want you to just develop a very basic understanding of when these valves are actually open. So essentially, when your atria are filling up with blood, these valves are actually open because the blood goes into the atria. The atrium may contract a little bit as well, and that will force the blood into the ventricles. Okay, so they'll be held into the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Now, at that point, the right ventricle and left ventricle need to generate tension. So they'll start contracting and they'll generate tension. They'll start to increase the pressure in the ventricles. It's very important at that stage, the aortic and pulmonary valves are actually closed. Okay, these only open when the pressure in the ventricle gets so high that it causes these flaps to just open. The pressure is higher than the pressure in the pulmonary artery and in the aorta, and it causes these flaps to open, and blood then goes off to the lungs and off to the tissues of the body. So I guess the main point is that when the atrio-ventricular valves are open, the aortic and pulmonic valves are usually closed. Okay, that's usually what's happening. We will cover the cardiac cycle in great detail in a future video. Conversely, what happens when the aortic valve and the pulmonic valve are open? When those valves are open, the atrio-ventricular valves are closed. So these valves only open when the ventricles generated enough tension to exceed the pressure within the artery, within the aorta, and with the pulmonary artery, and that shoots these leaflets out of the way, and blood goes off into those arteries. Now, in order for a ventricle to generate a lot of pressure, it needs to ensure that the blood does not go back into the atria. So in that situation, the atrio-ventricular valves are firmly shut, the ventricles start to contract, and the pressure is so great that, as I said before, there is a risk that these valve leaflets could bulge, and that's where the papillary muscles contract. They pull on those chordae, tendineae, those heartstrings, and they prevent these valves from bulging. So these valves are pretty much closed when blood is being forced out either into the lungs or to the rest of the body. But when the heart is relaxing and it's filling up with blood, it's what we had in the previous slide. The tricuspid and bicuspid mitral valve are open, and the aortic and pulmonic valve are closed. So hopefully you've had a very good introduction today on the anatomy of the heart in terms of where it's located, the layers of the heart, what it's made up of, including the pericardial cavity. We've gone through the chambers and the flow of blood, and we've talked about the heart being a double pump, how the right side pumps to the lungs, to the pulmonary circulation, and the left side pumps to the systemic circulation. What we're going to do in the future video is carry on talking about the functions of the heart, and I hope that you will join me again very soon.